I saw a need for a representation.
Nobody saw it coming. Not the bishops, not the Vatican insiders, not even the cardinals closest to the Curia. At precisely 11:55 a.m. Rome time, a short and cryptic bulletin from the Holy See's press office quietly dropped, so understated, so vague, that many thought it was a mistake. No press conference, no public address. Just a single jarring line. His Holiness Pope Leo I XIV has appointed his Eminence Robert Cardinal Sarah to a newly created position within the Holy See. That was it. No title, no explanation, no context. And yet, within 5 minutes, the Catholic world was ablaze. Why? Because Robert Cardinal Sarah isn't just any clergyman. He's one of the most polarizing figures in modern church history. A man once viewed as the spiritual heir to Pope Benedict XVI, a hero to traditionalists, a nightmare to reformers. And now he was back, but not in retirement, not as a relic of the past. He was being called into something new, something active. And if you know anything about Vatican politics, then you already understand. Nothing is done by accident. For years, Robert Cardinal Sarah didn't just represent tradition, he embodied it, a living contradiction to the modernizing winds sweeping through the Vatican halls. To some, he was a spiritual anchor. To others, a stubborn shadow from a past they were eager to leave behind. He was born in the rural highlands of Guinea, in a village without electricity, where faith wasn't discussed in classrooms. It was clung to in the dark. He grew up not in marble seminaries, but under dictatorship, persecution, and poverty. His earliest formation wasn't in Rome, it was under fire. That kind of origin doesn't just shape theology, it carves character. While others politicked and networked their way through the Vatican's labyrinth, Sarah climbed with quiet resilience. Not a strategist, not a campaigner, just a man forged in hardship and refined by prayer. And when he spoke, it wasn't to trend, it was to testify. He rejected the softening of doctrine disguised as compassion. He stood firmly against giving communion to divorced and remarried couples, a position that enraged progressives but earned standing ovations from traditionalists. He warned that the sacred was being diluted by the sociological, that Mass had become a performance, that the Church was trading mystery for marketing. And while others smiled for cameras, Sarah picked up his pen. His 2019 book, The Day Is Now Far Spent, wasn't just a bestseller, it was a warning shot. Page after page, he outlined the spiritual crisis eating away at the church from within. He didn't name names. He didn't have to. His words were sharp, poetic, and unmistakably clear. The message landed like a thunderclap in silence. 200,000 copies flew off shelves across the world, and yet, the Vatican didn't whisper a word. No congratulations, no endorsements, no polite acknowledgments, silence. Because to endorse Sarah was to acknowledge the very critique they wanted to pretend didn't exist. By early 2021, the silence turned into action. They called it retirement. He was 75, the official age when bishops step down. But in the Vatican, rules are flexible when convenient. Many leaders serve well past that threshold. Sarah wouldn't be one of them. He was quietly removed from his post as prefect of the Congregation for Divine Worship. No scandal, no farewell event, no statement of appreciation, just gone. Pushed to the side like a relic in a cathedral basement. But the faithful knew, so did the insiders. He wasn't retired, he was exiled. And while his name faded from headlines, his presence never left the hearts of millions who saw him as the last voice of conviction in a church drifting toward confusion. In Rome, he became a ghost, a man in red, seen in the pews of obscure chapels, kneeling in silence, watching, praying, waiting. And then the phone rang. It wasn't a grand moment. There was no spotlight, no archbishop knocking at the door with gilded parchment, just a soft trill, echoing through the quiet of a small stone house on the outskirts of Rome, a house filled with the scent of incense, the worn pages of theological texts, and the silence of a man who had stopped expecting much from Vatican phone calls. Cardinal Robert Sarah answered with the same calm dignity he brought to everything. No aides, no protocol, just a bishop in exile, living simply, wrapped in solitude, and surrounded by African iconography, a gentle reminder of the homeland that shaped him, long before Rome ever knew his name. The voice on the other end didn't introduce itself. It didn't need to. "Robert," it said, calm, measured, familiar. "It's time we talk." It was Pope Leo I XIV, the new pontiff, the bridge builder, the reformer, the man many had written off as the ideological opposite of Sarah. And yet, here he was, calling the very man many believed had been left behind. Leo didn't posture, he didn't sugarcoat, he didn't try to charm, he simply spoke. "I've been listening to the church," he said, "and I believe we cannot build unity without including those who felt pushed away." For a long moment, Sarah said nothing. Not not out of hesitation, but because he understood exactly what this meant. He knew the Vatican wasn't built on sentiment. He had watched how quickly favor could fade. He had seen men be applauded one year and quietly erased the next. He had seen what happens when popes change, when priorities shift, when loyalty to truth gets mistaken for defiance. He had lived through the silent exile. So why now? Why him? And yet, as Leo continued, it became clear. This wasn't a trap. It wasn't a photo op. It wasn't politics dressed up in piety. It was something else, something rarer. It was an invitation. Leo wasn't calling to bring him back as a trophy. He wasn't offering a consolation prize or a ceremonial title. He wasn't asking Sarah to tone it down or compromise. He was asking him to serve, again, but this time with eyes wide open, this time as himself. Sarah requested 5 days to pray, not to consider strategy, not to calculate the optics, but to pray. And when he said it, he meant it. There were no secret meetings, no phone calls to old allies, no carefully worded statements drafted by handlers. He simply retreated into the rhythm that had sustained him his entire life: silence, scripture, and solitude. Each morning, he attended Mass, alone. No cameras, no ceremony, just a crimson cassock slipping quietly into the back pew of a chapel many in Rome had forgotten. He spent hours walking his small garden, the gravel beneath his shoes, the wind threading through olive branches, the feel of the soil beneath fingertips, simple, grounding, real. Here, far from St. Peter's Dome and the politics it cast shadows over, Sarah sought only one thing: clarity. He read scripture not as an academic exercise, but as a soldier reading orders. There were no interviews, no leaks to the press, no anonymous sources. But insiders noticed something different, something subtle, yet unmistakable. For the first time in years, he looked at peace. Not the peace of vindication, not the satisfaction of a return, but the kind of peace that comes when you realize someone sees you, not for who they want you to become, but for who you already are. Because Pope Leo hadn't called to reshape him. He hadn't asked Sarah to soften his voice or trim his convictions. He didn't offer compromise. He offered clarity. He wasn't asking Sarah to step back into the fold. He was asking him to step forward with a mission, not as a figurehead, but as a force. When Cardinal Sarah finally gave his answer, it didn't come with trumpets. There was no ornate signing ceremony in St. Peter's Square, no choreographed photo op with choirs and cardinals looking on. There was only a single sentence. 12 simple words. If this benefits the church, I will walk. And just like that, the man once labeled too rigid, too uncompromising, too traditional for the modern church, was handed a role that had never existed before: special papal envoy to the global south. It sounded ceremonial, polished, diplomatic, but it wasn't. This wasn't a gold-framed title to hang on a Vatican wall. This wasn't retirement in disguise or a quiet way to ease tensions. This was a mission, a real one. This wasn't a desk job. This was deployment. Sarah wouldn't be buried in some obscure Vatican department, passing memos through layers of bureaucracy. He wouldn't be reviewing liturgical policies or attending endless roundtable discussions about tone and tolerance. He would report to one person, the Pope, directly. No filters, no gatekeepers, and his marching orders were crystal clear. Re-engage the parts of the church that felt forgotten. The mandate was bold. Go to the heartlands of faith: Africa, Asia, Latin America, the very places where Catholicism isn't fading. It's surging, not with marketing gimmicks or rebranding campaigns, but with martyrs, missionaries, and miracles. Sarah was being sent to the front lines. His mission? To reconnect these rising, fervent communities to the church's core mission: unity, evangelization, and doctrinal fidelity. Not to water it down, not to repackage it, but to bridge what was growing with what had been forgotten. To give voice to the faithful who had stayed rooted, even when Rome seemed to drift. This wasn't a comeback, it was a commissioning. Inside the Vatican, jaws didn't just drop, they locked in stunned silence. This wasn't business as usual. This wasn't a reshuffling of bureaucrats or the quiet promotion of another yes man. This was something altogether different. A senior diplomat, seasoned by decades of Vatican politics, reportedly leaned over to a colleague and whispered, "It's as if the Pope reached into the past to build the future." And in that sentence, the entire shock of the moment was captured, because Cardinal Robert Sarah wasn't supposed to return. Not like this. For years, he had been painted as the symbol of resistance. Resistance to reform, resistance to inclusion, resistance to what some called progress. To bring him back now, To empower him, not with a ceremonial title, but with a global mandate, it was seismic. Traditionalist platforms erupted with joy. Twitter threads lit up with phrases like, "Finally, restoration begins," and "the exile ends." Sarah was being hailed as the spiritual general who never surrendered, and now had been called back to lead. But on the other side of the aisle, progressive commentators panicked. Editorials emerged almost instantly. The return of rigor. Leo's first mistake? Is the Vatican moving backwards? There were warnings of a hard right swing, accusations of ideological appeasement, fear that Sarah's influence would ignite a new wave of internal division. The Church, it seemed, was holding its breath. But not everyone saw it through a lens of fear or triumph. In an office tucked behind Vatican walls, a young Nigerian priest, working quietly within the Congregation for Bishops, read the memo. He didn't rush to tweet. He didn't grab a mic. He just smiled. "Leo understands where the faith is growing," he said softly, "and Sarah speaks the language of growth." No outrage, no celebration, just quiet recognition. Because in places where churches are packed, where faith is lived with fire and sacrifice, Robert Sarah has always been more than a controversial figure. He's been a voice. And now, that voice was no longer being silenced. It was being sent. And the data doesn't lie. Over the past 2 decades, while pews in Paris have emptied and basilicas in Berlin have grown quieter, a different story has been unfolding elsewhere, one the Western Church has largely failed to understand. Because the epicenter of Catholic growth isn't in Rome anymore, it's in the global South. In sub-Saharan Africa, the number of Catholics has nearly doubled. In the Philippines, churches overflow on Sundays, with worshippers spilling into the streets. In parts of Latin America, entire towns revolve around their local parishes, where faith is woven into every facet of daily life. Here, Catholicism isn't just tradition. It's survival, it's hope, it's home. And yet, despite this explosive growth, these regions remain undervalued, often treated like spiritual outposts rather than vital centers of the faith. While the Vatican debates abstract ideas about gender theory, climate messaging, and administrative synods, the global South is facing very different questions. How do we remain faithful when our churches are burned? How do we keep preaching when our priests disappear? How do we build seminaries when we can barely afford roofs? These aren't philosophical concerns. They're life and death. And this is the world Cardinal Sarah knows. He doesn't just sympathize, he embodies it. Born into a region marked by political violence and religious persecution, Sarah's faith wasn't taught in safety. It was carved through adversity. His roots aren't in the ivory towers of academia or the diplomacy of Vatican salons. His roots are in the soil of a suffering church. He has felt what it means to be ignored, to be told that tradition is outdated, that discipline is rigidity, that orthodoxy is intolerance. But he never wavered. And now, he doesn't just represent the Church of the global South. He speaks as its voice. A voice not asking for attention, but demanding to be heard. When the Vatican finally released the full details of Cardinal Sarah's appointment, all doubt evaporated. This wasn't symbolic. This wasn't a PR stunt to appease conservatives or calm the storm of Vatican politics. This was power, real, unprecedented, and intentional. Because Sarah hadn't just been appointed, he had been authorized. He now held full Vatican backing to operate not within Rome's echo chambers, but in the very places where the church is bleeding and booming at the same time. His new responsibilities were unlike anything previously seen in the modern papacy. He would represent the Holy See in episcopal negotiations across Africa, Asia, and Latin America, regions that for too long were treated like the Church's outer rim, even as they became its beating heart. He would advise bishops not to modernize or dilute doctrine, but to bridge the sacred and the present, teaching how ancient liturgical traditions could breathe life into contemporary communities, not either or, both and. He would serve as a liaison in regions facing growing hostility, places where priests preach under threat, where sacred ground is marked by blood, and where the line between faith and fear grows thinner every day. But perhaps most importantly, his mission was to restore trust, not with flashy statements or bureaucratic committees, but with presence, with truth, with the kind of clarity that can't be manufactured, only lived. Because for millions of faithful Catholics around the world, the Church has started to feel distant, inconsistent, even fractured. And now, the man they believed had been pushed aside was being sent back, not just with a message, but with a mandate to listen, to unify, to remind a wounded church that it hasn't been forgotten. His first appearance after the appointment? Not Rome, not the Vatican, not even Europe. It was Nairobi, a deliberate choice. Because while the power brokers in Rome speculated and the global press circled like hawks, Cardinal Sarah bypassed the marble corridors of the Apostolic Palace and headed straight to the heart of the global South. There were no velvet thrones, no gilded altars, no Swiss guards lining the entrance, just a small press table in a modest hall, a few microphones, a wooden crucifix on the wall, and Cardinal Robert Sarah, dressed not in lace layered regalia, but in the simple red of a servant. No notes, no handlers, just a rosary wrapped around his fingers, and silence that spoke louder than any pre-written statement. Then he leaned toward the mic. 6 words, clear, calm, undeniable. I serve, I don't seek. It wasn't a soundbite, it wasn't branding, it was a declaration of purpose. The room fell still. And when a reporter finally gathered the nerve to ask the question that hung in the air, "Do you see this as a comeback?" Sarah didn't flinch. He looked up, not with arrogance, but with certainty, and said, "This is not a return. I've never left. I was praying. Now I am walking. No bravado, no bitterness, just quiet authority." Because for Sarah, this wasn't about reclaiming a spotlight. It was about fulfilling a call. And now, with the world watching again, he wasn't stepping back into power. He was stepping forward, into mission. For a church that has spent the better part of a decade locked in quiet civil war, left versus right, Francis versus Benedict, inclusion versus identity, reform versus tradition, this moment felt different. It didn't carry the usual friction. There was no applause from one corner and outrage from another, at least not in the way people expected, because this wasn't about choosing sides. This was about stitching up the wound. For too long, the global church has been caught in a tug of war, the faithful pulled between two camps, each claiming to represent the true church. Every papal address, every doctrinal footnote, every bishop's tweet dissected as either progressive or conservative, as if the body of Christ were a political battlefield instead of a place of worship. And into that noise stepped Pope Leo I the 14th, not with a hammer, but with a thread. He didn't summon Sarah as a symbol of resistance. He didn't anoint him to rekindle old debates. He called him to help build what comes next, not to restore some imagined golden age, not to tear down the reforms of his predecessors, but to remind the church that truth and charity are not enemies, and that conviction doesn't have to be cruel. Leo didn't place tradition behind glass like a museum exhibit. He gave it a task, a job to do, a role in the present. Because tradition isn't holy just because it's old. It's holy when it's alive, when it walks, speaks, and serves. And in that moment, Pope Leo made something crystal clear. He wasn't interested in canonizing camps. He was building a bridge, and Sarah would be one of its first pillars. One Vatican analyst summed it up best. Francis showed the world compassion. Benedict defended the truth. Leo is attempting to marry them, and Sarah has now joined that union. This isn't the end of the church's internal battles. It's not a magic solution, but it is something the church hasn't had in a long time: hope. Because if a man like Cardinal Sarah, criticized, cast aside, and called outdated, can rediscover his place, not in protest, but in purpose, then maybe the church can too. Remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel for the latest from the Vatican and the latest news.